Welcome to Sculpture Vulture. I'm Lucy Branch, a sculptural conservator and author, bringing you a series of interviews with some amazing sculptors who inspire me, and I hope will do the same for you. You can see the photographs accompanying the interview, the episode show notes, and get a free novel from sculpturevulture.co.uk. Hello, Sculpture Vultures, and thank you for joining me. During my interview today, I'm going to be talking to Paul Day, who has long been one of my favourite sculptors. He produces works that have such style and imagination that I have stood in front of many of them for lost hours. He's won many competitions and prizes. Many of you will know the meeting place in St Pancras Station, where two lovers tower above the public in a clinch that just makes everyone wish they had just such a lover. And other commissions, including the Battle of Britain, magnificent war memorial on the London Embankment, the Queen Mother Memorial in London, and the Urban Comedy in Brussels, just to name a few. So this interview runs a little bit longer than the others, and if any of you know Paul Day's work, you will understand completely why. They are often huge and detailed, and it's in the small things that so much of his magic can be seen. And so it is with this interview. I really struggled to cut it down because it all weaved so perfectly together. And so I encourage you to grab a cup of tea and settle in to enjoy a really fascinating narrative. There's just a couple of sound effects you might notice in this one. Sorry about that. There isn't a train going through my study at one point. It's actually just an incredibly heavy downpour that I obviously couldn't control during the interview, and it was pummeling my walls so hard that I'm quite sure you'll hear it. And also, time to time, I think Paul may have been doing a little bit of sketching, which just shows you how much of a creative soul he really is. So today I begin by asking my favourite question, which is, have you always been creative?
As far as I can remember, as a child, enjoyed from the very beginning drawing, colouring in, painting pictures and cutting things out with scissors. And I had a mother who was and is still very encouraging in arty and crafty things, but also I was number two to an elder brother who, at 3 years of age when I turned up, already occupied the main stage in all the family gatherings. He was a natural imitator, raconteur, and loved the limelight.
Tough act to follow.
Well, quite. I was the younger brother who, obviously with 3 years less in development of language and everything else, could never keep up with or overshadow this strong and powerful figure in my life. And I think that drawing was the one way I discovered quite early on to draw some of that limelight and attention onto myself, and to be able to make, for example, members of the family laugh and smile with my pictures, whereas I wasn't able to do that with my oratory or my ability to tell jokes, of which I don't really have an ability to tell jokes.
But the thing is that it sounds like the pencil did the job.
Well, it was also a bit of a cop-out probably, because enjoying drawing and painting and art as a child, it possibly led me to not perhaps work as hard as I should have done at school on other subjects. I mean, I did manage to become head boy of my primary school, but what really sort of floated my boat was to be able to be top in art. And I remember when, towards the end of my years at primary school, we went on a youth hosteling holiday to Canterbury, and for a week, and each day we did organised trips. Obviously we delved into the history of the Canterbury Way and pilgrims and the cathedral and so on. And when I came back, I did a series of drawings on I think it must have been an A3 format or perhaps A2, of cartoons, of caricatures for each day of our holiday, where I put my classmates and teachers into comic situations. And I remember in particular that my teacher at the time who taught me to swim, actually. But she ended up with a swastika armband and a whip at the side of a swimming pool, shark-infested swimming pool, full of children. And of course, the headmaster was very tickled by when he saw these drawings, and they went up on the wall in the school assembly hall. And so I suppose I realised that although I wasn't very good at sort of narrational writing, as it were, stories, I could tell stories to make people giggle, silly things through the drawing, and that probably set me on my way to eventually working to where I am now.
And so when did sculpture start to feature?
At the age of teen, when I'd done A-levels, and I did do art A-level, which I passed, thank the Lord, because I got D's in maths and physics. But once the A-levels were through, and my then girlfriend had chucked me to go off to university, I had to get a job, quite simply, to put a roof over my head. And that involved looking in the local paper, finding the column of job vacancies, making a phone call, and it was with the Midland Bank, looking for an apprentice bank manager. So
sounds like an excellent, very sensible job to me.
Indeed. Oh, totally. It was either that or the civil service, I think. Those were the two options that opened up for me. So at just about 18, I started work as a trainee bank manager with the Midland Bank in Creepy Crawley of West Sussex. So yeah, on the very first day of my banking financial career, I realised that working for a bank was a huge mistake. Just going to an office in a suit felt so uncomfortable and wrong that I knew I had to get myself out of there quickly. And of course, the one thing that I'd shown some sort of moderate aptitude for was art. And another thing that had been a constant throughout my childhood was an interest in birds and animals. So my theory was, and my thinking was at the time, well, if I can get myself out of the bank, I might be able to one day do some illustration, make some money. The bank was an interesting place to learn about human nature, about the working world, about the relationships between grown-up people at work. It was all very interesting.
Just not for you.
Well, no, because I was an outdoorsy sort of person. I used to go off bird watching. I liked, nature. I wanted to have the sky above my head, and sitting in an office looking at computers or counting and trying to add up checks and so on was absolutely anathema to me. But I eventually worked out that art school or a foundation course at art school might be something I could do. Now, the question was how to finance it, and not having any money and having a father who wasn't interested. I turned to my mum and stepfather and who had moved to the county of Essex, and asked them if by any chance were I to find financing to do a foundation course, they'd happily have me to stay for a year, which they agreed to very willingly. And I eventually managed to obtain a grant from Essex County Council, not that I'd ever lived in Essex, to go and study for a year at the Colchester Institute College to study an art foundation course, which turned out an incredibly significant move for me.
Just shows you, doesn't it? Actually, we're so ill-equipped at like 16, 17 to make decisions about what we're going to do with our lives. How we just, it can be the complete opposite. I mean, I studied like maths and sciences and totally ruled out art because of the fact that it was around me all the time. And so it was so familiar to me that I was like, no. The thing is that it completely within a very short amount of time, a couple of years, I'm thinking, but that's naturally the most obvious thing I'm interested in, art. What on earth am I thinking? It's actually been useful for me to have done chemistry particularly. But the thing is that you do think to yourself, why do we ask these big questions of these kids? My son is picking his A-levels at the moment. And, I'm sure he's not going to do anything to do with the A-levels that he ends up taking.
Lucy, it's funny you should say that, because my own children, who obviously grew up around art, my son decided to go off and study law. He lasted 6 months and then he went off to do something else. My daughter studied business and international management, and both of them are now showing, at long last, a desire to do something creative, having rejected what they knew as children.
I know.
So,
I spend my life saying, just keep your mind open. Don't close your mind to anything. I was like, learn as much as you can in everything. I think they should give kids a good few years off, go and, I don't know, volunteer or something for a few years until they get their heads sorted before they have to start concentrating on exactly where life's taking them.
Well, I think that there is a universal law which says that parents are always wrong.
Yes.
So therefore, the children, as it were, need, I think, to discover for themselves, what and rejecting what the parents do. Apparently, because I didn't really have a teenage rebellion, but for most children, that rejecting of what they know is part of the growing up sort of rite of passage. So yeah.
When did you fall in love with it then, sculpture?
Well, that's an interest. No, I love the phraseology actually of that question, because on my very first day at this new sort of weird place called Colchester Institute College, and I'd never done any sculpture other than a bit of pottery, I fell in love not with sculpture but with a young lady who happened to be on the same course as me, and who had just come from finishing A-levels at Rodin, and was a beautiful brunette young lady with dark brown eyes, and obviously inquisitive and extremely cultivated. And that lady went on to become the lady with whom I share my life even now. So I met Catherine on that very first day at art school. So that was the sort of love of my life, as it were.
And she was on the foundation course?
She was on the foundation course, yeah. So come from a very well-prepared background. I mean, the art department and Rodin had obviously given them opportunities to do life drawing, taken them off to Amsterdam, visited museums. I mean, they'd had a proper art education. So Catherine came to the foundation open, understanding materials with an eye for composition, and I came just with an HB pencil, a pencil sharpener, and a desire to draw things in the most accurate and detailed way that I could, because that is, for me, my understanding of art meant it had to be basically almost photorealism. Yeah. Otherwise, it wasn't any good. I had no idea about art. I mean, none whatsoever. So the foundation course was a bit of an eye-opener, actually, because all these sort of trendy young things who were coming to art school, they seemed open to these strange ideas. Like drawing with thick lumps of charcoal on the end of a broom handle, or painting abstract compositions. I mean, I didn't even know the name abstract, let alone know what it was. I was 2 years older than the majority of my peers, and very conservative, very wet behind the ears. I just thought I wanted to illustrate books on birds, basically.
Yeah.
But art school forced me to look at the creative process a bit differently, and it was quite uncomfortable because by that stage lots of young people didn't seem to be interested in what it was that had motivated them about art in the first place, which was making pretty pictures. They seemed to have this appetite for politics and for delving into the psychology of art, whereas I hadn't got there yet. I was just wanting to make pretty pictures. But Foundation did allow us to play around a little bit with materials. You had to do printmaking, photography, video, painting, a little bit of sculpture, but it wasn't clay. It was sort of making things out of bits of wood and gluing them together, and not what I call sculpture. It was sort of like industrial assembly. But throughout the period, my friendship with Catherine and another good girlfriend, the three of us became studio mates for that year, led me to learn a bit about painting and a bit about charcoal drawing, so that when the year was over, the logical step was to apply to do a fine art degree in painting. I still hadn't really any concept of sculpture. And I like to tell stories. I wanted to make sort of illustrations, really.
You can see that in all your work.
Well, it's just,
it's all over it.
Why fight your nature? If that's where you feel comfortable. I mean, one of the first artists to ever interest me was Peter Bruegel the Elder.
Oh.
I was 11 when my mum took me to the National Gallery in London for the first time. We looked around at various paintings, and then at the end of a visit, she allowed me to buy a little book in the bookshop. And the book I found and fell in love with was a small dolphin book on Peter Bruegel the Elder, with the fall of the rebel angels, and with Mad Meg, and with the triumph of death. And these reproductions were only the size of a postcard, but I was drawn into the visual complexity and
drama,
and the sort of nightmarish imaginary world that Bruegel so beautifully portrays, without understanding also the absolute complex beauty of his compositions at that stage. And all I could see was the profusion of fascinating detail. So while at Foundation, I was trying to find subjects for my work, because apparently you had to have a subject. As an artist, as a young artist, you needed to have something to paint about. Well, I'd never even thought about that as a concept. I just liked, if I saw a bird of prey, I thought, I'll do a picture of a kestrel. If I saw a mouse, I'll do a mouse on a stalk of wheat. I mean, my thinking was pretty shoddy, but because the tutor said, if you want to paint figurative pictures, which was already an anachronism as far as the teachers were concerned, then it had to be about something. Why not work? So, not having really done any work in my life other than a bit of gardening and sitting in the bank, I started to paint pictures of people on building sites. And that became the sort of backbone, I think, of my portfolio for an application to firstly Cheltenham, then Exeter, then Dartington, because each time I went for an interview, I failed to get in. So, failed to get in at Cheltenham, failed to get in at Exeter, scraped into the art in a social context course at Dartington, because they said, well, you're Christian, you're white, and you say your family read the Telegraph, and we've got nobody like that, so you'll make a good whipping boy.
Oh, I bet they're kicking themselves, the other ones. I bet they're like, what did we do?
I'm not sure, but they I think they barely looked at my portfolio. They just thought I would be an amusing clown for other people, mostly on the left side of the political spectrum, to take the mickey out of.
This sounds like I'm name dropping here, but it was just a funny story that my son happened to be in primary school with Chris Martin's daughter, and Chris Martin the singer, Coldplay, so super successful. And I remember him one day telling me, I was bemoaning something, and him telling me that he had applied over and over and over again to get in the choir, and they wouldn't let him in. He said it was like every year he was rejected from the school choir.
Well, it's nice to know that one's not alone. He's been successful, though. I mean, that's the difference between us. But
yeah, magic. And I mean, you think, what on earth were people thinking? How did they not see it?
Well, perhaps the thing is that that rejection is actually part of what made him tenacious and able to sort of handle the music industry. So it's quite funny to me in a way. You see, at the time, I was thinking, crumbs, if I get rejected 3 times, I'm going to be back working at the bank. Having had a year hiatus going to art school, I was going to end up back in some sort of dead-end, dull job, or at least as I saw it, dead-end and dull. Apologies to all those people. I know that one can flourish in any environment, provided you're the right person. But for me, that wasn't an environment in which I could flourish, and I respect bankers, I can tell you, because I rely on them. But at the same time, you've got to be in the place where you should be. And of course, my wife sailed into Bristol Art School on her very first interview, which made it all the more galling. So for me to fail on 2 and to scrape into the 3rd, well, hey ho, that's life. And while I was at Dartington for 6 months, there was one of the periods of work was in the sculpture department, and so I actually got an introduction into sculpture at Dartington. Now, admittedly, I don't think they were really interested in teaching art, because I think it was a very left-wing biased sort of art in a social context, and the tutor spent most of their time trying to teach you that traditional art was a sort of bourgeois legacy from the 19th century.
Yeah, very out of
Yes.
fashion, wasn't it?
Oh, totally. And that what they wanted to do was to teach young people that we're all creative. Anyone can be an artist, and that art isn't to hang in galleries. It's to sort of express opinions and ideas and so on. And that so the focus of that course wasn't to learn how to be an artist. Now, I sort of get the idea that everyone has a creative fibre within them. Of course, I believe that. But the fact is, I just wanted to sort of somebody to show me how to learn to draw. And of course, I wasn't going to get it by staying at Dartington. But I did have an opportunity to invent myself a little sculpture in metal. And so I sort of learned to weld and made a metal wall relief on the subject of music for the music department. Now, I'm sure health and safety would have had it melted down years ago because it was full of sharp bits of cut, barely rounded steel sticking jaggedly out from a wall. But at the time, I was quite chuffed. And so that sculptural experience prompted me to make an application back to Cheltenham Art School, my original art school of choice, halfway through the first year. Because Dartington was obviously somewhere where I wasn't going to, they weren't teaching art. They were teaching politics, the politics of art, which wasn't what I wanted. And Catherine, so my girlfriend, who, at the time, it became wife, she helped me put together a portfolio of drawings and photographs that looked like I could be a potential sculpture student. Because Cheltenham, when I phoned them, had said, we've got no place in the painting department, but we've got one space in the sculpture department. If you want to come and bring a portfolio to join the sculpture department, be our guest. Mm. So I did. And I managed to pull the wool over their eyes. Or perhaps they thought I was so square that they needed something funny in the course. And accepted me for that reason. But anyway, for whatever reason, they allowed me to come and join for the start of the second year in Cheltenham in the sculpture department. That's what really sort of set me on the path, because knowing I wasn't a sculptor yet, well, in fact, still not really. No, seriously, Lizzie, it's just a fact. One has to face facts, I could draw a bit, I could illustrate a bit, and because I was then going into a sculpture department, I had to pretend somehow to be interested in sculpture. Well, what I discovered was clay on that course, thanks to Nicholas Stevens, the then head of sculpture, who was a ceramicist. He'd been out in California with David Hockney in the 60s. He'd made all sorts of wacky and incredible clay sculptures. And you see, clay was also off the agenda for sculpture in those days. You did ceramics if you wanted to work with clay. You didn't pretend to be a fine art sculptor. And yet, when I went to the library and looked at the entombment or deposition sculptures of Nicola dell'Arca, and these incredible sort of nun-like characters with the wind blowing their billowing robes made of terracotta. I mean, for me, seeing those blew my mind. I thought, hang on a minute, clay is a material for sculpture. Come on, let's not joke about this. Clay's always been the material for sculpture. Rodin made sculptures in clay. Most of Bernini's sculptures started life in clay. I learned that clay was a perfectly acceptable material for sculpture.
But it's almost like you're having to do it sort of off camera because it's out of fashion.
No, but nobody else was touching the stuff. They were sort of cutting pigs' heads off in half and sticking them on stakes and casting them into bronze. They were disassembling vacuum cleaners and inflating large plastic shapes, like balloons. They were people sort of. The people on the course, who were very, inventive, intelligent, a lot of them were creative people, just had wacky ideas that I couldn't understand. And I just thought, well, hang on, isn't sculpture basically making figures in clay? Isn't that what sculpture is? And that's what I understood sculpture to be at that stage. So, there was...
It's like teach yourself sculpture.
It was, but at the same time, I think that the criticism and the environment of sort of debate and discussion actually was very helpful to me,
Yeah.
because ultimately, I felt that, yes, if I'm going to do this, if I'm going to make sculptural art of any description, I've got to have something to say. I've got to have a direction for the work to travel in, to explore something about the world. And so for me, that became, well, there were two aspects to it. Sculpture, for me, was relief. It was making pictures in clay. Clay being such a sensitive and fine recorder of gesture and time. The slightest mark on a wall of clay can open up a great sense of space, depth, a sense of speed and time, and energy. So clay was a fabulous recording device, but also I realised that the subject that interested me at the time was simply the things I saw around me in the street, in particular in the town centre of Cheltenham. The town centre of Cheltenham became it was where I would observe just members of the public going about their ordinary lives and be absolutely bowled over by the wonder and the miraculous nature of the ordinary. Because, I've always had a strong Christian faith. I've always believed that life isn't a happy accident or even an unhappy accident. I believe that there is purpose and meaning in everything, and in particular that small things are never to be underestimated. A mother wiping the snotty nose of her little child in a pushchair, in my eyes, sort of became as like the Virgin on the Rocks for Leonardo da Vinci. That relationship between a small child and a mother is a constant throughout the history of humanity. It remains one of the sort of the fundamental building blocks upon which society is made and has flourished. And so I don't know that, for me, and I was thinking of Bruegel as well, who celebrated ordinariness and made it transcend the ordinary into something utterly extraordinary, spiritual and transfigured. Bruegel's work has been a constant source of inspiration for me because of not only the humour, the incredible balance within his compositions, the extraordinary intelligence of the way he sees the world and of his abilities, of course, pictorially, but also the way in which the small becomes absolutely monumental. The Return of the Herd, one of the series of the 12 calendar months, which has now become one of the 4 seasons because the others have been lost and destroyed over time. But the brooding storm, the monumental landscape, the extraordinary movement within that herd of cows, and yet the anecdote, the detail, the simplicity of life, it's the fusion of the ordinary and the miraculous, I think, in his work that is a constant source of inspiration to me, because I never see, or I try and foster, at least within my looking at the world, wonder, playfulness, and joy, without being sort of naive to the world's dark side, to the evils, to the...
Don't we have enough of the difficulties and things like that? I think that's where I escape from, where sculpture takes me away from it.
Well, yeah, and if art is part of a form of redemption for the failings of humanity, it's like, we've been given the tools, the imagination to be able to sort of look into the dark, but also redeem it in some way. Somebody like Goya, of course, has a vision and a darkness to his work, and yet sometimes within that, one can feel perhaps, thrown on the rocks of destiny and destroyed by the darkness. But there are other times where there is even hope in some of the blackest work. Bacon, I think, is somebody who takes the sort of the visceral and quite a lot of negative and turns it into something incredibly beautiful, incredibly transformed, and something that becomes an object of great deep joy, although the outward subject would appear to be violence.
When you're talking about the ordinariness as well, and sort of reminds me of Lowry, the kind of everyday and the on the streets, and again that there's always that darkness in the background, which makes it interesting. But yet there's
Yes.
also joy in the, I don't know, children playing on the street, or
Yes.
I don't know, that balance.
Well, no, completely, Lucy. I think that the contrast, the light and shade, which makes the world stand out so beautifully in relief, can be also reflected in the mood, obviously within a composition of work. Where there might be an undercurrent, a deep sort of dark undercurrent, and yet there might be some very light and frothy and joyful aspects. It is more difficult, I think, to create force in a piece that is sort of happy. Force seems to come through brooding, through darkness, but
Intention.
yeah, certainly my early works based on observing the people in the streets of Cheltenham allowed me to fuse the figurative anecdotal, sort of the anecdote, with an architectural backdrop. And the architectural backdrop could also become a character, obviously, within the picture, and create tension, even if what the figures were doing was light-hearted. The architectural backdrop could give gravitas, or vice versa. There could be something quite dreadful going on between figures, and yet the background somehow bring a sort of lightness or almost a frivolity to it. So yeah, I think the narrative in art and the storytelling aspect of art is still something that I find gripping and interesting. And I struggle when if I'm asked to do sort of, portraiture of figures, because just on their own without a context, I like to put things into an imaginary context so that I can create a relationship between a person and a place, or people and a place.
So it sounds like that narrative style, actually, it was there right from the beginning.
Yes, when I was talking about those cartoon drawings I did at primary school, showing the days of our week's youth hosteling holiday, that's essentially in a nutshell. I think I've always been drawn to the illustrative. In the past, when I was at art school and in the years subsequent to that, there didn't appear to be many people interested in that sort of narrative approach to art. And then, of course, as time's gone on, there are artists who've been very successful in contemporary art, going back to a sort of narrative approach to things. I mean, I don't know much about contemporary art, to be honest, but Grayson Perry does these pots with sort of characters and stories on them.
But it's been a huge, in terms of history of art, faith-based art, it's all narrative. Think of the Giotto frescoes, and it goes back centuries and centuries. But just not, less so in sculpture in contemporary times. So it's just like you readopted it. It felt so familiar. Maybe it's because of the faith background that you have, a familiarity.
Partly, certainly, because I when I look back at art history and look and admire, for example, the relief work of Donatello, or of the bronze doors of the baptistry and so on. The great relief work across all the cathedrals of Italy, actually. There's so many examples of miraculous and beautiful relief work, whether it be high relief, low relief. Whether it be the Southern Renaissance, the Northern Renaissance. Living in Burgundy, as I do, of course, Burgundy has a strong tradition from the 14th and 15th century of Burgundy went up into the northern countries, into Holland and Belgium, and so the tradition of altarpiece carving and sculpted reliefs is very strong here. Obviously, they're the Flemish primitives, and we have one of the most exceptional Roger van der Weyden paintings in the local town here in Beaune. We have the Last Judgment, and so those complex narrative scenes have always floated my boat. I did a long piece of work in, when I say long, both literally and figuratively, in Belgium for a banker. How many feet? It's 75-foot long terracotta frieze called The Urban Comedy. And it's not really very well known. I don't even know if you can find pictures on the internet, but it's a story about Brussels, and it's a story that is both surreal and historical, very much a kaleidoscope of both images and times and places that I put together logically and with a reasoned sort of way of thinking. It's like a visual novel actually of Brussels, and so I spent time up there and realised actually that, well, obviously Bruegel was born in Brussels, and his work developed there. The city of Brussels has a tradition both with altarpieces from the 14th, 15th century, but also with comics from the 20th century. And so for me, in a sense, I can be inspired by both the high art and the sort of the lowbrow art, as it were. But where a plot is, a story is told, where characters develop, I love to see those scenes where the Bible stories are told in many stories are told in the same picture.
Yeah.
And so your eye travels over the surface and you read, you see so much. I don't know, for me that sense of time, the time element that narrative allows is very precious. And of course with sculpture, when you're moving along the surface of, for example, that relief, the urban comedy, you might spend half an hour of your time moving across the surface. And as you move across the surface of a relief, the relationships between the characters change as well, depending on what angle you're looking at. And therefore you can introduce almost an interpretive sense as well. So one scene, one particular spot on the relief seen in one way seems to say something. And as you move around it and the characters change place, the scene can say another story, and so it's full of possibility.
Did you say 70 feet long, that
75
sculpture?
feet.
75 feet.
Yeah.
I mean, long, large, that really has become your niche, hasn't it?
No, it's been forced upon me. Yeah, I'd never have chosen to spend so long on a piece. I spent 18 months making the urban comedy. I spent 3 years making the Battle of Britain. This is a long commitment. It's tiresome. It's boring at times. It's a struggle to maintain interest, despite how exciting and exhilarating the subject can be. It's a labour of love. It's real discipline. And I'm not a particularly disciplined person, but I've had to become, committed. And I like doing small domestic pieces because I'm very impatient. I want to move from one subject to another very quickly. But when I'm asked to create something as long as, say, the urban comedy, it's a real challenge for me. And I have to say it requires a sense of duty and commitment.
Well, it's a marathon, isn't it? It's a sort of, and there's something about anything that's a very long creative process that you have sort of, you inevitably have a saggy middle where, you start very excited and then, it tails off for quite a while and but then obviously there's the finishing energy that comes.
You have a flurry at the end. I love that.
And
I love your description of a saggy middle. I'm going to use that in future. I'm going to borrow that one from you.
Oh, no worries. But it's definitely when I'm writing, I find that the middle, I'm really could be either there or here. And then suddenly you go the ending, and if obviously the bigger the project, I'm sure you get the bigger the high. Because when you come to the end of some of the 75 feet, or anything enormous, that's got to be an amazing high to get to the end of that and stand back and go, it's done.
When we had an unveiling in Belgium and had thousands of people come into this underground brick cellar to see it, it was great to have the feedback from people who recognised their home city, who recognised the humour, the historical narrative, the political narrative that was woven into it. It was a highly researched piece.
I have to ask you about the meeting place because for me it's a very special monument. I go back there very often when I'm all sorts of moods, but because I'm moving around London a lot, it's really easy to pass. So it's one that I can come, visit and feel like I can, some people go and meditate. I go and look at sculptures, but particularly that one. What was that like to unveil? Was it magic?
No, no. And now the reason it wasn't was because it wasn't finished at the unveiling.
Oh,
And therefore I got lots of horrible criticism in the press over it. And also it was a fascinating sort of project to be invited to work on. But it was also desperately fast. And because I'm not a sculptor, obviously being asked to make sculpture was quite a challenge. I mean, yeah, I've done a few sculptures, as it were, but most of my work's been relief. So working on this couple, which had been commissioned, I mean, I'd been invited to come up with some ideas for the railway station, and I came up with three, two of which were sort of reliefs, but big, monumental, sort of three-dimensional type of reliefs that had the potential for narrative and storytelling and background and so on. And the one obvious idea that I suppose stuck most closely to the brief I was given was the couple. And of course, the commissioners of the sculpture went for the most obvious one, which was the couple. And therefore, but I only had 3 months to complete the design and make the scale model for that sculpture. And I would have really benefited from 6 months to teach myself how to make sculpture and then do a proper job on it. As it happened, it didn't turn out badly. It turned out the couple, I thought, and you know, this is coming from somebody who doesn't really consider themselves to be a sculptor, more of an illustrator, but the couple had a stylization which was very deliberate on my part, because I wasn't looking to do anything realistic. I wanted them to sort of be icons, sort of like symbols of love, and symbols of love in a future time when the British physiognomy will look very different, perhaps in 100 or 200 years, because so many different nationalities now. Anyway, so I didn't want to illustrate English people on that plinth. I thought, well, what would English people look like in 500 years? And so there's a little bit of influence from Greek, and there's a little bit of influence from India and from Assyria, and it's sort of a stylization, while at the same time making them look like they're sort of believable people. But obviously they avoid the question of ethnicity.
Absolutely.
You know, which I thought for that piece was probably relevant in a way. I'm not a woke person and I'm not a politically correct person, but I do think about meaning and I try and think about things as truthfully as I know how. But so yeah, when the unveiling happened, the statue was sitting on a sort of temporary wooden plinth, which looked a little bit like a sort of school trophy. And therefore, I think that the press thought, well, is that it? You know, this giant couple looking a bit sort of grotesque on a wooden plinth. It just looked probably a bit wrong. And so therefore, and some people probably were annoyed that I got given this commission anyway. So there were some very nasty things said about the sculpture and me in the press, which made the unveiling, I felt like I should probably go and live on some small island in the South Seas.
Oh,
you know,
my goodness.
I was quite tender and you know, frail at the time.
Just such a beautiful sculpture. There's something that makes you, every time you walk into that station, you think to yourself, I hope there's that love of my life like that. I mean, it's a wonderful thing, and it's very easy to criticise people in the world, isn't it?
I don't mind. I don't want people to I don't want people not to say what they think, I must say, and I don't mind being the butt of people's jokes or anything, actually. But what pleased me was that I was able to subsequently, 18 months later, we were able to finish the job with the frieze around the base.
Yeah.
And the frieze around the base is a little bit more it was more compatible with what I was used to. And I also wanted, you see, to create a foil to this giant romantic idyll. I wanted there to be a scene that would actually make people smile, laugh, talk to each other, be curious, and show relationships actually in real life, slightly sometimes dysfunctional, sometimes ambiguous, you know, not necessarily working as the sort of romantic idyll. And I felt that because the clients wanted to call the sculpture the meeting place, if people were going to stand around waiting for some member of the family to come back on a train, then just standing underneath these two giants wasn't really a particularly engaging experience. Yes, it had a power, but I felt that by creating a visual narrative of a relief around the base, it allowed people to look at something in detail and to get up close and to touch and to feel a story, albeit not a particularly, it's not a precise narrative. It's more a sort of series of suggestions of narrative. But I've noticed when I've been in the station on those rare occasions that actually a number of people really do take the time to look at those reliefs and talk about them amongst themselves. And so the engagement with the public, which was in the brief, they wanted a democratic piece of artwork that would appeal to as wide a number of members of the public as possible. And so I think that the brief was fulfilled, and that people get pleasure touching the dog's nose, wondering about the soldiers going off or coming back from war, asking questions about who's doing what. It was censored by the great British media, of course, because there was a bit of a scandal prior to the installation, where I was asked to change the composition a little bit, so as not to offend anybody. And we know how easily people are offended these days.
Yes.
But basically, it's pretty much as I planned, and I feel that it's a curious piece of work.
So has there been commission where you stood back and you thought, that's it, if I never do anything ever again, I've done it?
No, because every time I finish a piece of work, or every day I leave the studio, there's a part of me which feels reasonably content with the work that's gone on, and there's another part of me which just looks at the gaping holes and the dreadful flaws. And so I hope I won't lose the desire to grow and to try and become a sculptor in my life, because I think that, I don't feel as if I've scratched the surface, in a sense, of what being a sculptor is. I do feel that I've done a fairly large body of work, and the reliefs themselves have added something to the history of the relief as an art form. Yeah. But I've got, I'm never going to be a great academic sculptor, because I was never trained to be an academic sculptor, and I probably don't have the talent for it. But I do think I've got a talent for interpretation and for coming up with an innovative solution to a problem.
Could you tell us where people can find out more about you?
Well, I have got a website which is going to be rebuilt this year because it's not up to date, but it's not bad. And so that's probably a good place to start. I mean, I don't know what Wikipedia says about me, but it probably isn't very up to date or accurate. So I have a book, actually, but it's not. I haven't got it on Amazon. I've got a really lovely book, which people can buy off me if they send me an email.
See, that'll have to be added to my library.
It's got 300 pages. It's got a foreword by the Prince of Wales. It's got a lovely essay by a gentleman called John Russell Taylor, who has been a critic for the Times for many years as a film critic, and lots of pictures. And it's really beautiful, big hardback book, coffee table book. But I haven't had time to sort of promote it in any way. So I just sell them to people who come into my studio or give them to clients. And
social media, is that you or not?
I've got an Instagram account, which I'm not using at the moment because the work I'm doing I can't publish because it's sort of secret and under wraps, and it's an 18-month project. So for the moment, my Instagram posts are very few and far between.
Right.
But there is an Instagram account.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Paul. It's been a great chat, and I hope to speak to you again soon.
Oh, I'm delighted that you asked me, and it's been a joy to talk with you, Lucy. Thank you.
There's just so much that I could say about what we discussed, but for time's sake, I'll limit myself. I was particularly interested in his journey through to that discovery of clay, and not just because it twisted and turned so much, but because the value of higher education is such a topical one right now, because of the eye-watering amount of money that it costs to go to university or to a higher educational college in so many countries. It's making people ask big questions like, is it worth it? Is it good value for money? You might lose a whole decade in repaying that debt. There's certainly truth to this point, and I can see why the debate is so hot right now. But if you look at what Paul's higher education gave him, it opened his mind. It pushed him to expand. It widened the walls of what was quite a small life at the time, and led him on to such incredible depth of knowledge about art, which has been the foundation of his career. But also you can tell from the way he talks about art that it's not just a job. He is nourished by it and enriched by that part of his life. And I'm not trying to say that university did or college did all that for him, but it was the beginning. It was the start of that road. On the more practical side, I think it's incredibly comforting to know that a professional creator can get bored and frustrated during the creative process. The return to the studio, or say for me to the page sometimes, it isn't all putty blowing trumpets and angels singing in harmony as he works. Part of it inevitably is the saggy middle, which is going to be taxing and demand real grit, but it's about enduring that part of it and pushing through. That actually is the distinction, I think, between considering yourself an amateur and a professional. My very last thought, I promise, is that we have to be open to our creative paths, even when they take us somewhere other than what our own plan is. Paul didn't choose long and large, but it certainly chose him. And for all his very genuine, self-depreciating, humble words about the fact that he isn't a sculptor, it's so obvious why large is his thing. Whatever you want to call it, universal energy, the motherlode, or God, something sometimes presents us with a path that we hadn't planned out for ourselves, and it draws us along it. I think being observant to that, those outer signals, can be so valuable. And of course, if we are able to combine our own ambitions with that external something, as Paul has, I think then you're in a place where you can create something very special indeed. Next episode, I'm going to be speaking to Martin Jennings, portrait sculptor, whose bronze of John Betjeman stands in St Pancras Station alongside Paul Day's work. He has commemorated some fascinating characters in bronze. Mary Jane Seacole, the British-Jamaican businesswoman and nurse who did so much during the Crimean War, Charles Dickens in Portsmouth, and George Orwell at the BBC Broadcasting House. This man is a titan in the sculptural world, and his creations are so clever and perceptive. So I'm absolutely sure that you'll be as excited as I am to be able to talk to him and hear about his creative journey. If you're looking for a new book, please consider one of my novels about the dark side of the art world, where sculpture is always at the heart of the story. You can get them on the show website, on the usual online retailers, or even better, keep your local library alive, ask for them in there. Thank you for joining me today. Sculpture Vulture has been brought to you by Antique Bronze.